And so let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to our NCITE seminar series, which is sponsored through the Department of Homeland Security. This seminar series is put on behalf of myself, Dr. Garibay, and Dr. Daniel Island. In addition, we have two wonderful PhD students who are working on this project, Cynthia Zucon-Buffon and Lauren Prada. We also have Shahab Bumi, who's been helping out. And so the purpose of this seminar series that we're kicking off today is to sort of link a few worlds. So here at UCF, we're very interested in developing our next generation workforce within the Homeland Security enterprise, particularly focusing in on the applications of machine learning and AI. But in order to do that, we really want to make sure that our students have a domain knowledge in order to apply that technical knowledge. And so one of our big efforts here is to link the technical and the domain. And so as part of that, we're kicking off this seminar series where we invite experts in industry, academia, and government to come present on their current research. And today we're very lucky to actually have Dr. Peter Simi to come speak to us. So Pete Simi is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Chapman University. He is actually an executive member of NCITE, so the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, which is headed up by Gina Ligon and team at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. For the past 25 years, he's been studying political violence, hate, and extremism. His fieldwork has taken him inside white supremacist groups across the US, where he has been embedded with racist skinheads, Klan members, neo-Nazis, and anti-government militias. Much of his research has been funded by the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Guggenheim Foundation, and of course, NSF. He's co-author of an award-winning book, American Swastika, Inside the White Power Movement's Hidden Spaces of Hate, and he's published more than 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters related to political extremism, street gangs, and juvenile delinquency. With that, you probably see his work all over the place. If you Google him, you'll see him Rolling Stone, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Good Morning America, Larry King, CNN. He's been there, done that. He's definitely one of our great experts. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Dr. Simi for his presentation on trends in right-wing extremism. Thank you, Dr. Simi. Feel free to grab control.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here virtually, and thank you for the generous introduction. I'm going to see if I can share screen here. Let's see, yes. And good. Okay, I think we're doing good here. I want to talk to you today about, start with January 6th, ask the question, how did we get here? And borrow from Merrick Garland's recent statements on this during his confirmation hearings, which is that there's a straight line from the founding of the Ku Klux Klan shortly after the Civil War to the Oklahoma City bombing to where we found ourselves just over a month ago, January 6th, at the Capitol siege or insurrection. So I want to ask some questions about who was present and how we can understand who was present for January 6th, and then more broadly, the kind of history and patterns that we've seen with right-wing extremism. Just say a few things just that inform my approach. In addition to working in academia, I also spent 10 years in the mental health field, and that certainly had an impact on how I look at right-wing extremism. And I also work closely with a private nonprofit, Life After Hate, that was founded by former white supremacists that aims to try and help in terms of through interventions, individuals leave violent far-right extremist groups. And so that's given me, I've been working with them almost 10 years. And that's given me an opportunity to work with them in terms of evaluation and program development. So I thought, I would start by showing you a short clip of the first group that I was embedded with starting back in the winter of 1997. And I have some video footage that I didn't take. It just so happened that the group I initially started doing field work with in the southwestern part of the United States, they were being filmed by a documentary film crew. And eventually a piece of that footage that was taken ended up on a CBS program that's long since been canceled, but 48 Hours. And so I thought I'd show you just a couple minutes of the group just to kind of give you a sense of two of their main members.
Hey, Peter, I think some folks are having some trouble hearing the sound.
Oh, okay. Shoot. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we need to share the video outside of PowerPoint. I don't know.
Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. Did I not? Well, it's embedded in the PowerPoint. So I thought, do I need to share it differently?
I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Here we go. I forgot to hit the sound. Okay, let's try this again.
Who is this in a white car? White car, is it the neighbor? Oh, it's just a neighbor. If they only knew.
Getting in touch with Johnny is very, very.
Oh, what? Was it? Are you able to hear now?
Yeah, the sound's working out perfectly.
Okay, great. Let's see.
Some fight or something that they felt was around the corner.
And who is this in a white car? White car, is it the neighbor? Oh, it's just a neighbor. If they only knew.
Getting in touch with Johnny is very, very difficult. Johnny doesn't have a phone. He doesn't have a regular schedule. So the only way to really get in touch with Johnny is to go over to his place.
So we pull up, Craig and I, and of course as soon as we turn into the driveway, I mean, I'm hearing this thing coming over us. Oh, it's a low-flying helicopter.
Who's that?
That's Johnny with the gun.
Yeah.
All right, get out.
I'm waiting for him. Did you see the helicopter? Or what?
Yeah. What was that?
I think it was either the FBI or somebody. They were flying around, and they've been around a few times and crossed over our house several times. So that's kind of unusual.
We've become yet another source of information for these guys on their network.
Did you notice the plane? Did you guys get any numbers off of it?
You mean the chopper?
Chopper?
No, we actually didn't see him because, like you said, he was flying in low. We were coming from that way, and we couldn't see him until he was right on us.
Yep. They're always one in the chamber, it's always in there, the ammunition's always in there. But it wouldn't normally have to be like that. And this is for our government, our federal employees that we pay for through our taxes, the taxes they take unlawfully from my paycheck. And who is this in a white car? White car, is it the neighbor? Oh, it's just a neighbor. If they only knew. I don't quite understand, except for maybe they don't like what we're saying, or they don't like the way we have our guns, or they like to get us back for Ruby Ridge, or,
me and Laura are just like caught up in the whole thing. And is it a federal helicopter? Are they doing surveillance?
What's going on, Wallace?
Well, I was afraid that somebody might be taking pictures of people's guns, and I wasn't involved. You'll never know.
Right on, Wallace. You see the bird that flew over? You didn't? As soon as you left?
Oh, I heard it. Did it fly right over you?
Zeroed right over you and us all.
Really? I heard him. Couldn't really see him though.
What you got there, Dave?
Oh, my baby. Mini 14, the scope, 40 round clip, flash suppressor, illegal now.
See, there's that van, that truck over there.
Okay, I want to just give you a little sense of Johnny's trajectory. His trajectory in particular is quite interesting and really kind of all over the map. So he starts out in the early 80s in southern Nevada, actually as a peace punk, anti-nuclear, very involved in anti-nuclear protests. And eventually he's introduced to posse comitatus, which is the idea that the county sheriff is the highest law of the land, and what was called the Committee of the States, which is based on the posse comitatus doctrine. And he's attracted to those ideas. And by the mid 80s, he's kind of starting to move more in the direction, given his punk background, to the skinhead scene as that starts to emerge in the US. He becomes a racist skinhead and eventually adopts what's called Christian identity, which is essentially a white supremacist interpretation of the Bible that suggests that whites are the true children of God, that Jewish people are the literal descendants of Satan, and then what they call non-whites are essentially subhuman. They're not fully human. So he adopts this Christian identity and then eventually relocates to a much more kind of rural area from where he grew up, and moves in the direction of a kind of paramilitary, and eventually starts a militia group that he calls the Rocky Mountain Militia. So he really, in one person, represents a blending and an overlap of a lot of different strands within right-wing extremism. And I think this is important, and I'm going to come back to this point as kind of one of the central themes for the talk, which is how much overlap there is in a lot of the things that we see within right-wing extremism. I want to now shift back a little bit in time. And this is just a couple minutes, but the question is, and of course we all know the answer to this, this is not a new problem, but I just want to play this very short clip to kind of underscore that point. Let's see.
At the turn of the 20th century, America's social landscape was changing rapidly. Urbanization, industrialization, and a massive influx of Jewish and Catholic immigrants from Europe. The Klan began a violent campaign to terrorize immigrants and exploit fears that immigrants threatened American values. By the 1920s, Klan membership was over 4 million. During the 1930s and 40s, Klan membership again declined, but the Klan experienced a resurgence during the Civil Rights era. In the 1950s, blacks began to demand an end to the Jim Crow laws in the South that legally supported racial discrimination. Seeing the Civil Rights Movement as a threat to white rule, the Klan went on the attack. Between 1955 and 1965, Klansmen or Klan sympathizers carried out over 200 bombings and murdered 40 civil rights workers. Brutal images of Klan violence turned public opinion against the KKK. By the end of the 1960s, the FBI was successfully infiltrating the Klan, and its leaders were being prosecuted. It seemed the Klan had been defeated.
Okay, so why would the Ku Klux Klan be relevant for our understanding of January the 6th, given that there wasn't a substantially visible Klan presence? I show that clip in part because I want to focus on some of the underlying themes that we heard in that short clip in terms of resurgence of the Klan in the 1920s and then again in the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights era. And what we heard was social change, demographic change, in particular in the 1920s, as being a major catalyst for the resurgence of the second era of the Klan in the 20s, changes in immigration patterns. And then in the 50s and 60s, more social change around political and cultural issues, in particular, the emergence of the civil rights movement and the efforts towards desegregation. In both cases, we're talking about very similar types of underlying themes. And I think we see that play out most recently. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So now moving forward, but still in the past, I want to talk a little bit about the period of time in the late 90s between 1995 and 2000. And I think this is an important precursor to what we then see more recently over the last 20 years. Of course, in 1995, of April 95, you have the Oklahoma City bombing, which at the time was the largest act of domestic terrorism in our country's history, 168 dead, including a number of children. Tim McVeigh is pictured there, and he represents a variety of different elements of right-wing extremism. He was inspired by a book called The Turner Diaries that was written by William Pierce, who was the founder and leader of a group called the National Alliance, which was one of the more prominent neo-Nazi groups in the 1980s and 90s. He was connected to a variety of folks across the country, McVeigh was, and he actually tried to make contact with Johnny from the earlier clip. Fortunately for Johnny was out of town at the time that McVeigh went to southern Utah and tried to make contact with Johnny. He did make contact with Johnny's mother, who was also involved in the movement, but nothing really developed. Johnny was a suspect initially in terms of John Doe number 2. There was a drawing of John Doe number 2 that was suspected to have been with McVeigh. Ultimately, the government, moved away from that theory and claims that there was a mistake and there actually wasn't a John Doe number 2. Again, fortunately for Johnny, but he was investigated for a period of time. So in '95, this is happening in terms of Oklahoma City. Just a little over a year later, in the summer of '96, the photo below, you have Eric Rudolph, who executes an attack on the Summer Olympics. And 2 people are killed, more than 100 injured. Many more would have been killed. The pipe bomb that he placed at Olympic Park was certainly powerful enough to kill scores of folks. Fortunately, first responders, including the efforts of security guard, Richard Jewell, helped create some distance between the individuals who were gathered in the area where the bomb had been planted. But Rudolph, after the Olympic Park bombing, goes on to commit 3 other bombing attacks, including 2 abortion clinics and a gay nightclub. Eventually, after 5 years of living out in the wilderness of North Carolina, he's eventually arrested. So this is just a little over a year after our largest act of domestic terrorism in '95 at Oklahoma City. Then we get the Olympic Park bombing, followed by 3 other terror attacks by Rudolph. Forward to 1998, and you see the photo of this Barry here, along with 2 other individuals. They murder James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas. Byrd is African-American, is tied to the back of their pickup truck and drugged for miles. It decapitates him. He's beheaded. So in other words, we have in 1998 in the United States of America a beheading. That is again committed by 3 white supremacists. Barry and the other 2 perpetrators were all heavily involved in white supremacist groups. Below Barry's photo are the shooters in the Columbine, which is now we're moving into April of '99. Oftentimes Columbine is seen as a school shooting, which it was, but it was intended to be a school bombing. And the perpetrators in particular, Kevin Harris, was very much enthralled with both Adolf Hitler and Tim McVeigh. And in fact, Columbine was meant to outdo McVeigh. Kevin, in his writings that were discovered after the attack, there's a lot of discussion about him hoping to basically get a higher body count than McVeigh was able to, and how much of a hero McVeigh was to him. So while the bombs were not ultimately didn't detonate, they obviously did commit the shooting portion. They had intended to wait outside, and after people started to exit after the bombings, those who weren't killed by the bombs, they were going to essentially open fire on. Because the bombs didn't work, they went into the school and committed the shooting rampage there, where a number of people were killed inside the school building. Again, that's not really understood as a type of right-wing extremist terror attack for the most part. Mostly reported as more just a kind of generic school shooting. So putting that in, so now we're at April of '99, and then that's followed by two terror attacks in the summer of '99. Ben Smith and Buford Furrow. Furrow commits a shooting rampage in Southern California, attacks a Jewish community center, and Smith goes on a shooting rampage in the Midwest and kills several people. Both of them were very heavily involved, committed members of different white supremacist groups. Furrow is pictured there at the Aryan Nations in northern Idaho, where he worked as a security officer and was heavily involved in that organization. Smith was heavily involved in the World Church of Creator, was considered to be one of the most effective leafleters by the World Church of the Creator, had been actually given an award by Matt Hale for being the creator of the year prior to his terror attack. So these were two folks that are very heavily immersed. The point is that, and these are just a few examples, unfortunately. In fact, actually, the 10 years after Oklahoma City, the Southern Poverty Law Center documented at least 40 plots, many of which were thwarted, but still a very high number of efforts. And then in some cases, obviously, some of these plots were not thwarted, as represented by these six photos here. So we had this wave of terrorism in the second half of the '90s that we didn't really perceive as such. It really didn't get the kind of attention that it should have gotten. And then, of course, 9/11 comes along, and this completely goes off the radar screen. Now, we start to see, and these are numbers taken from the extremist crime database that Steve Shermack at Michigan State and Josh Freilich at John Jay have been working on for quite some time, and gathering data about the crimes committed by extremists. And here you see between 2001 and 2016, it's roughly even between right-wing extremists and Islamic extremists, with slightly more fatalities by Islamic extremists. We start to see that shift more recently. So when you look at 08 to 17 Anti-Defamation League figures, you start to see now the shift of much more towards right-wing extremism in terms of fatalities. So now we're at 3/4 of fatalities are committed by right-wing extremists. And then this just kind of continues essentially. And so now when you look at 18, it's almost exclusively fatalities in the US are committed by right-wing extremists, and the numbers kind of continue even more recently. So we had this major wave in the second half of the '90s, and of course, there have been earlier waves prior to Oklahoma City, but just in terms of that second half of the '90s major wave, start to see continuing high levels of violence over the 2000s, but especially after 08, you start to see the numbers really starting to shift heavily in the direction of right-wing extremists. And of course, that coincides with the election of our first Black president, Barack Obama. And that's when we see a major resurgence in a lot of activity across the spectrum among right-wing extremists, including a second wave of militia groups. So I want to now move more into the kind of types of right-wing extremist groups, how they're organized. And you see a kind of standard network map, which might be used to depict how right-wing extremists are organized. And you can imagine the nodes could be either groups, organizations, they could be leaders, they could be members, rank and file followers, in that respect, in other words, persons or groups typically. I'm going to ask us to think about it a little bit differently, but first I want to talk about how it would be populated if we were to think about these nodes as groups. So the kind of standard approach is what you might call a group-centric approach. And it's looking at the different types of right-wing extremists and essentially placing them in three major types of buckets. And, I'm going to offer a critique of this, but I can't tell you how many times I've presented it this way. So it's an insider's critique. There certainly is value in looking at the organization of right-wing extremism according to these different categories or buckets. I'm not suggesting there's not. So when I get to the critique part, I'm really suggesting more of an alternative, not a replacement necessarily, but another alternative that might provide different kinds of value. But let's first go through this kind of conventional group-centric approach. White supremacists, we've been talking about that. You've got your oldest type, the Ku Klux Klan. I mentioned Christian Identity already. Of course, prior to World War II, we had the kind of proto-Nazi type groups, the German Bund, for example, was one of them, was able to fill Madison Square Garden. So that there was a certain following prior to World War II among kind of proto-Nazi folks that were sympathetic to what was happening in terms of the rise of fascism in Europe. Of course, World War II impacts that. And then really we see the rise of neo-Nazis after World War II, in particular with the forming or the foundation of the American Nazi Party by George Lincoln Rockwell around 1950. And that continues to this day. Racist skinheads, which I mentioned earlier, we really start to see them emerge in the US in the 80s, and they're still around today, although they certainly don't have the same, that style, the shaved head and the Doc Marten boots and flight jackets. That style and the tattoos that went along with it has faded quite a bit, but there's certainly still a presence of those folks. And then most recently, this so-called alt-right associated with people like Richard Spencer, groups like Identity Europa, essentially a rebranding effort to present white supremacy in a more polished form, in a way that might be more palpable to a larger segment of white America, in a way that seemed less threatening, more innocuous. So that just kind of covers the gambit of white supremacists. You've got your anti-government militia, so-called patriot types. Here we've heard a lot recently about Oath Keepers, which was founded in 2009, in part because several members have been indicted as a result of the January 6th siege. Three percenters, and then I mentioned earlier sovereign citizens, which are connected to the Posse Comitatus movement that dates back to around the late 60s. Sovereign citizens essentially claim that there's a certain kind of natural citizenship that people really don't need to pay taxes. Driver's licenses are unconstitutional. Basically claim that the federal government, basically, that it's taken people's liberty and people succumb to really unwarranted authority that the government actually doesn't possess. And so it's essentially an explanation for how citizens can kind of take power back in their own hands away from the government. And it has all kinds of kind of arcane different ideas about the flag and about the government's actually a corporation. And it gets into some pretty fine detailed aspects to it, and oftentimes gets pretty convoluted and confusing. And then the third kind of major type of right-wing extremists are what are called single issue. And so you can think of anti-abortion, anti-immigration, and so forth. My critique of this approach is that one of the things I think is if you were to approach this issue, if you approach the far right from a critical race perspective, racial politics cuts across this whole spectrum, right? It really underscores a lot of this. And there's, the buckets, while helpful to some extent, are a little bit too narrow, and they don't allow for the kind of overlap that actually exists in the empirical world. And so Johnny, again, go back to him as a perfect example. It's really not that uncommon to see that kind of movement across really essentially all three of these buckets. And of course, really, I would argue what we're dealing with here is a broad worldview. And so while, groups are important, the broader worldview in some ways, I would say, is more significant. I think there's also, kind of an unintended consequence that these kind of, categories reinforce that white supremacists wear white sheets or shave their heads, that anti-government folks look different, and so forth and so on. And so then if you have people who don't fit the part in terms of the appearance, there's a tendency to not see them potentially in terms of, while they may have beliefs that are very, consistent with these categories, if they don't appear a certain way, we don't see that. We kind of miss the fact that they adhere to certain beliefs. And of course, one of the things I think we'd have to ask ourselves is why in 2008, after Obama's election, do we see the emergence of a second wave of the militia movement? If it's only about, federal government overreach, if it's only about constitutional issues, if it's only an anti-government concern that they have with the Second Amendment being infringed upon and other liberties, being taken away from them, why didn't they reemerge during George Bush Jr.'s administration, especially after the Patriot Act? You would think, given that that's one of the most substantial assaults on civil liberties in recent history, you would think that would have been the catalyst for a second wave, but instead it was the election of Obama. And so, I think, that's quite a coincidence. And so I think we have to look at the racial dynamics that undergird anti-government militia groups. And oftentimes, for example, one of the recent Oath Keepers who was arrested for his involvement in DC, Donovan Crawley, he was quoted by his mother after Obama was elected as saying that the only good N-word is a dead N-word. And so again, while he's an Oath Keeper and he has this anti-government philosophy, he clearly also has substantial racial animus, including advocating violence based on those racist beliefs. So again, in my experience in the field with folks who called themselves patriots, called themselves militia, that was often the case, and it wasn't necessarily something they advertised real overtly, but it was something you would discover once you sat down and started talking with them or spent some time with them. Then you would start to hear the racial animus, the anti-Semitism, the homophobia, so forth and so on. And it's really not uncommon for the anti-government militia groups to also be anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim. So again, we're getting a lot of bleeding across these three categories, so much so that at some point, the distinctions, I think become a little bit, so blurred that, then you force them into categories. And I think that can potentially create some distortions in terms of understanding. So what I'm suggesting today is a little bit of an alternative approach. Instead of looking at the network as in terms of people or groups, I'm suggesting we look at it in terms of emotions and cognitions. And then what do we see and how does that help? Do we see something different? Here are just two kind of samples of networks, emotion, the green and red, and then black and white is cognitions or beliefs. And of course, these are populated quite differently than we would populate them with if we were doing a network for right-wing extremism. I would suggest that for right-wing extremism, anger would be much more central. We would see frustration, disgust, fear, kind of all central. And I think racial resentment is definitely near the center as well, that fits in. And in terms of cognitions, you would see, I think, national citizenship, different notions about anti-government. Some would be a truly anti-government in terms of really wanting to get rid of all forms of government, almost like an anarchist. Kind of an anarchistic type anti-government. Others would be more just focused on the anti-federal government, as I referred to earlier, like the posse comitatus with the government's fine, but just not beyond the county sheriff. And then a government replacement that's really not government anti-government at all. It's just anti the government we have. And you see this with accelerationists among neo-Nazis that are often discussed and described as being, wanting to tear the government down, which is true, but they want to tear the current government down. They want to bring about a collapse of the current social system, basically, but they hope to replace it with something that they believe will represent the true kind of instincts of human nature in a more beneficial way. So they do see a government replacing what currently exists, but a more pure one based on their ideology. Which I would say is very much along the lines of kind of a notion of survival of the fittest. And I think that would be another kind of core part of a belief network that would apply really across right-wing extremists, which would be some kind of notion of survival of the fittest. I want to talk about how this might apply then to a real world kind of example that hits pretty close to home for me. On my left, you see a billboard that says "Stop Immigration, Join the National Alliance." And I mentioned to you the National Alliance earlier in the 80s and 90s was one of the leading National Socialist neo-Nazi groups in the US. And it has their phone number and their website below. And they're depicting, a map of the United States that's essentially being invaded. I took that photo in Las Vegas about 2002, I guess it was. And, as you can imagine, some people probably drove by that and didn't pay much attention to it. Other people might have noticed it, but then just kept driving. Of course, it was off the side of a freeway, which is not super probably. I mean, it gets a lot of traffic, but on the one hand, but it just, I would assume a lot of people, even if they were interested, might not have been able to make note of the phone number or the website. So as far as the effectiveness, I think it's hard to say. But I want to show you then, next to it is a Facebook post that actually one of my relatives reposted. Not proud to say that, but you'll notice the depiction in terms of the graphic depiction of an invasion coming from the South. So that idea of immigration being an invasion is something that has been very prominent for decades among white supremacists in their literature, on their websites, in terms of their talk, how they refer to immigration, that notion of an invasion. That has become much more mainstream in recent years. And this post from Facebook was reposted millions of times. So the circulation, the traffic is really extraordinarily different than what you see with that billboard. And it's got some text there explaining that George Soros is behind the caravans. Well, this doesn't specifically mention Soros, but that's behind a lot of this rhetoric. But suggesting that there is funding of the caravans that's coming from some type of dark corners, shall we say. And I sat down and I talked to my relative who reposted this and asked them, I said, do you realize that this is actually white supremacist propaganda? It may say females for Trump, but this, I can show you, propaganda from neo-Nazis that this is nearly identical to. And they had no idea. And they seemed quite sincere and quite shocked that they had reposted something like that. Now they do share the views expressed in the post nonetheless. But, one of the things that I think when we think about emotions and beliefs as being the, kind of the way in which this is organized in terms of some type of network formation is it allows us to see how much more this extends beyond groups, beyond leaders, and especially with social media, is able to saturate environments and is able to touch people that will never actually be involved in a right-wing extremist group in any kind of formal way, but will participate in some way or another in terms of things like a repost on a platform like Facebook. And so, I think we need to account for the extent to which right-wing extremism is becoming more pervasive, in the sense that it's circulating more broadly than certainly ever in the time that I've been studying it. This is the kind of where things are at now is what they'd hoped for when I first started studying right-wing extremism in the mid-90s. They were hoping for this to come to fruition, and it actually has, as a result, in part, of technological changes, in particular social media, as a result, in part, of kind of political, changes in the political context and certain political opportunities presenting themselves. We see this kind of mainstreaming of right-wing extremism in a way that we just haven't seen, certainly over the last 25 years, for sure. And so, when we talk, we kind of, talk, a lot of this recruitment is both formal and informal. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about more of the formal, but keep in mind, a lot of things happening, especially in terms of social media, are very informal. But we do see recruitment happening both on the ground as well as online. So that the offline spaces where right-wing extremism circulates continues to be important. Of course, the family is a primary space where it can circulate. Public rallies, including rallies like the anti-lockdown during COVID that we start to see spring up, that those became a site where right-wing extremist groups, if they weren't necessarily organizing them, although they did certainly play a role in organizing them in many cases, but even if they weren't, they're able to attend them and make contacts with other right-wing extremists and potentially recruit folks into the fold who may share, a common view about the idea that the government's going too far with the lockdown measures and the social distancing and so forth. And then that common ground is used to try and bring the person further down the rabbit hole, so to speak. Music traditionally has been a major kind of avenue for recruitment. And then in terms of virtual spaces, again, we talked about social media, but gaming platforms for young people in particular is a real issue. And music comes up again in virtual spaces because there's so much online music. And then that's true of music in general. There's so many different music platforms now, live streaming and so forth. And so they're able to use that to their advantage and able to circulate various genres of right-wing extremist music, in particular white supremacist, which includes, folk style type music. It includes techno style music, as well as more like heavy metal, punk rock type music. So it's a whole gamut. Country, there's a kind of a racist white supremacist style of country music that you see as well. So lots of different genres, and the music's both on and offline. And I want to, just real briefly, you mentioned that in terms of the platforms, they cover a wide spectrum. There's the more mainstream ones like Facebook that I've mentioned quite a bit already, but certainly Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. YouTube's got a little more strict recently, so is Facebook and Twitter. But still, there's ways around the kind of thresholds that they're setting in terms of the algorithms. And they're fairly easy to get around. You can create spaces in words that will allow you to post things that would normally be prohibited with some of the changes that they've made recently. So, and then there's the more kind of secretive encrypted type platforms like Telegram has gotten a lot of traffic in just the last couple months. And it's interesting about Telegram is at one time it tended to be the more hardcore for the most part, but now, Don Trump Jr. has a Telegram channel, Kayleigh McEnany has a Telegram channel, Sean Hannity has one, so forth and so on. So Telegram's picking up a lot of traffic. Of course, Parler was the big one that we talked about, where a lot of planning, frankly, was happening for Jan 6. Siege, and of course that got shut down, although I believe now it's back up, and certainly they were trying to get it back up as soon as possible, and it took a little while, but I believe it now is back up. So you get a wide spectrum in terms of platforms, and we find, in looking at the platforms, there's certainly plenty of violent talk on these platforms, including talking about targets like committing school shootings, and I should say that these are quotes from hardcore white supremacists who are talking about using schools as a target, in part picking schools based on racial and religious and ethnic demographic characteristics. So the kind of vitriol online is really quite substantial, and we see it used by folks committing attacks to post their manifestos and to even live stream, as what happened in Church Christ in New Zealand with the terror attack on the two mosques there. Okay, I don't think we have the last clip here. I was going to end with this is kind of this idea of deep penetration. And the problem of right-wing extremism has gotten so, really in many respects out of control, in part because a lot of it, we don't see it because there's been an infiltration strategy. There's been encouragement to join the military, to, not get tattoos, to, get a job as a teacher, become a police officer. This has been advocated for now about the last 4 decades. And so you've had this time to allow for some pretty deep penetration within our social institutions. And so you have folks embedded in these institutions that, even if they're not involved directly in groups, although many times they are, but even if they're not, they're adherents of the cause. And so they're looking for opportunities to essentially do things that are favorable for the cause. They're looking for ways to express themselves that's consistent with their beliefs, that they do have to be careful about kind of camouflaging to some extent, but then looking for those opportunities to really openly express the inner beliefs that they hold very dear and that they feel very committed to. And so that really kind of wraps up. I just want to end with just some terms of responding. I think we can look at this in terms of push and pull factors. We've got a real problem in our country, I think, generally with mental wellness and not emphasizing mental wellness nearly enough. We should be focusing on mental wellness in our families and certainly focusing on it at the K through 12 level in a very substantial way. And you're starting to see some schools experiment more with this, but this should be a kind of a no-brainer for us, and it's not. So we could do a lot more with mindfulness and teaching kids to really be able to regulate their emotions in a healthy way and deal with adversity and build resilience. And we could really invest a lot more in that. And unfortunately, we don't. And we know that for folks who get involved in right-wing extremism, we don't exclusively see a lot of trauma, but we do. That's definitely a pattern. It's not present in all individuals who get involved in right-wing extremism, but we definitely see a pattern with folks who experience childhood and adolescent trauma that goes unresolved. So, the more healthy we could be as a society in terms of emotion and mental wellness more broadly, obviously, the more we could do to, I think, build some barriers in terms of prevention. And then we just have a lot more work in terms of the informal extent to which racism and other forms of bigotry remains normal in our society, and that's got to be something we make a commitment to really resisting and confronting first, because there's a lot of denial around that. And then the pull factors. I mean, we've got to do something about social media. It's a lot of uncharted territory, and we really are kind of flailing in terms of trying to understand how to regulate it and where the most effective strategies. We see a lot of efforts around deplatforming, and that's certainly probably part of the answer, but not exclusively. So we've just got a lot more work to do about understanding things like misinformation, how it circulates on social media, and then as well places like gaming platforms and how to deal with the problem of right-wing extremism on gaming platforms. And then the biggie, and this is the elephant in the room, and there's no easy answers, obviously, is political polarization. Right-wing extremism festers, and extremism more broadly, it festers in societies that are characterized by high degrees of polarization. And so as long as we remain as polarized as we are, with 50 million people thinking that the election was stolen, a large number of people thinking that January 6th was a protest and it was legitimate and it was patriotic. As long as we have that kind of polarization where people are essentially living in different realities, it's going to be really hard to address the problem of right-wing extremism in a more meaningful way. So I'll end there, and I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. I apologize, I was trying to cut it a little shorter.
Thank you, Dr. Simi. That was absolutely wonderful. We're going to try to do a question and answer with the time that we have. And, I hope we can do this in an organized way. So What we can do is, if you have a question, put your hand up. Feel free to type the sort of summary of the general question in the chat, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and unmute you one at a time so that you can go ahead and ask your question. But with that, I do want to start with Aaron. I'll sort of let him lead the way. So let's see, ask to
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Simi. That was very fascinating. And so I was really interested in your recategorization of extremism into categories of emotion and cognition. And so I'm curious what you think the role of the pandemic has played now, given that that has such a strong influence: mortality salience, terror management theory, evolutionary psychology. I think all these things would predict what we might even be seeing, but I'm curious what you think about that in the pandemic's role.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example of one potential value added of focusing on emotion and cognition, is because when you have a crisis like COVID come along that requires greater social distancing, at least from a public health perspective, to have some effective approaches. So in other words, requiring some degree of isolation, increasing time spent on virtual spaces, really creating high degrees of emotional kind of instability, really uncertainty, certainly frustration, depression. So there's all these emotional reactions that are quite natural and normal to COVID. But then when you couple that with the problem of misinformation that's being then circulated online, where people are spending more and more time, and I just saw a figure and looking at the amount of exposure people had during COVID to misinformation versus, say, center of disease control type information. I mean, and it's exponential in terms of the difference. I mean, it's really striking how much more misinformation people were exposed to. And so when you couple those kinds of distortions, cognitive distortions of sorts, along with these very normal, natural emotional reactions, that's a recipe for disaster. And I think we've seen that play out, unfortunately.
Our next question comes from Dr. Gina Ligon. What strategies would you recommend to differentiate those who hold the beliefs versus those willing to act on the beliefs?
That's a great question. And this is in many respects kind of one of the $1 million questions, certainly. I don't think there's, one of the things you see when you get inside the culture, in a way, getting inside the culture makes it more confusing, because you see how common it is to engage in, for instance, violent talk. And one of the things we find is that for some people, the violent talk is a kind of conditioning factor. It helps build them up to actual real violence that they engage in. So there's that aspect to the violent talk, but there's another type of reaction that people seem to have in terms of quite the opposite. Engaging in the violent talk is kind of allowing them to blow off steam, vent, kind of get their frustrations out. And those folks, the violent talk doesn't seem to escalate into any kind of violent action outside of these kind of cultural spaces where the violent talk is so prominent. So, and we really don't seem to understand why some individuals respond one way and other individuals respond another way. I think it's also critical to point out, especially with the online communication being so much more prominent now, that if you were to look at situations, for instance, the Pittsburgh synagogue attack, Robert Bowers, who was posting quite a bit right up until the attack, and even actually posted essentially that he was going to commit the attack, more or less, that he said, "F your optics, I'm going in." He'd been posting prior to that a number of anti-immigrant posts and so forth. This is primarily on the Gab platform. So the question is there an escalation? Is it possible to discern any kind of patterns in terms of his posts over time that would have given us a better idea that this person now is moving more close to violence, prior to the last post where essentially he tells us what he's about to do? And you do see that with some of the other attacks, where at the very end, there is substantial essentially leakage, but we don't want to wait till that point, because obviously at that point it's too late. So is there earlier in the process of individuals posting, is there ways to discern that? And I just haven't seen it yet. I mean, there's efforts underway, but real clear cut patterns in that I haven't seen. So I think, the question is super important. I don't think we have good answers at this point. I think part of the answer is we need to have, we need to take these groups and these beliefs seriously, and there needs to be intensive monitoring, obviously within the Constitution, but there does need to be intensive monitoring, and of course non-governmental organizations have they have greater latitude to do that, so that's why it's really important for organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and Southern Poverty Law Center and many others out there to play in that role and help really kind of try and focus in on what the extremists, what their activity, is involved, but also where the escalation seems to be occurring.
I actually had a quick follow-up to that. Has there been any work that has sort of examined the normalization of violent beliefs? So I think to your point, that transition from speech to action is a significant escalation that's difficult to predict. But if we have knowledge that particular folks are embedded in sort of these communities of hate, does that sort of foster that jump, right? Where if they were in, a little bit less connected, that we might not see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can borrow some from criminology here. One of the best predictors of future violence is past violence. So understanding more the networks that people are embedded in is, I think, super critical to being able to discern where the higher risk folks are.
Our next question comes from Marina. So Marina, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute, and she has a question about misinformation. Let's see.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. My question kind of ties into your example about your relative, where you broke it down for them that these were neo-Nazi beliefs that they were unknowingly spreading around the internet. I've had similar discussions with people and tried to present what I thought was fact to dispel some of these ultimately discriminatory beliefs. But I found that when you are confirming these beliefs, even if it is misinformation and maybe you're presented with counter evidence, so to speak, there's no motivation to change your view. So we know that misinformation is a huge problem, but how is it that we get back to the place where people are interested in what facts or truth may be? And I think that's a huge barrier to stopping the spread of right-wing extremism. It's like there's no motivation to be honest or to be truthful. So that's my question.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And, I only told you half the story about my relatives. So there was an immediate reaction, which is, oh gosh, I can't believe I did that. And for about 2 weeks, the person did stop posting, pretty much stopped posting altogether. They kind of got off Facebook for about 2 weeks. And then after about 2 weeks, they're back on Facebook. And this has been maybe a year and a half ago, that they're posting the same old stuff. So there wasn't a happy ending to the story, unfortunately. So, and when you think about it on a larger scale, I mean, we have multiple people who are state legislators who participate in Jan 6. We have a person in Congress who's QAnon that talks about the Rothschilds, which is code word for, the quote unquote international Jew. Where are the consequences for spreading misinformation and spreading this kind of hatred? There just really aren't much. So I don't think there's a good answer to your question. I think it's an important point, but I don't see any clarity in terms of how do we get back. Yeah, I wish I had something more, something better to say than that. But I feel somewhat at a loss right now in that respect.
Thank you for your question. Next up, we have Sean. So let's see if we can get him unmuted.
Mute. Okay. Yeah, my question's a very simple one. I'd like to know if this presentation will be available on like YouTube.
Yeah, so we're gonna look into seeing about posting this a little bit.
Yeah,
later.
I got here late. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Next up, I think we have Katie. I'm gonna try to find her. There we go. Katie, if you're ready, you should be getting a prompt to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. My question really, and you brought up QAnon in there, is what connections have you seen between right-wing extremism and the conspiracy theories and conspiracy groups?
Yeah, great question. I meant to mention QAnon because they're a good example, again, of some of the limitations of the three categories that I presented, because where do you put them? QAnon is interesting because they recycle a lot of old right-wing extremist tropes. So they're recycling a lot of this anti-Semitic stuff about the idea of there being kind of an international Jewish conspiracy type stuff. So that's a big part of QAnon. In addition to obviously the focus on children and the predatory behavior directed towards children. There is a real anti-Semitic aspect to it. And when QAnon kind of got into the COVID denial stuff, they really focused on the idea, for instance, that Bill Gates, if you trace his family back far enough, he's connected to the Rothschilds. So again, they're really using a lot of anti-Semitic tropes. The idea that Henry Kissinger gave a speech in 2005 or 6 to the World Health Organization where he supposedly claimed that they were going to use vaccines for mind control. It's a speech that he never actually gave. It doesn't exist. Made it up. But Henry Kissinger is also would be code for, again, quote unquote, the international Jew. You also see things with QAnon that get into the kind of posse comitatus, sovereign citizen stuff that I mentioned earlier. You're seeing a lot of Q's focus on the idea that America's not a democratic republic anymore, that's become a corporation, talking about the fringe around the flag as proof for that. So, they really recycle a lot of kind of old conspiracy theories. But what's interesting about them and somewhat innovative is that social mediated. And it had that kind of almost video game-like quality to it in terms of this idea of the Q's giving these puzzles and people try and solve the puzzles. And so there was a kind of an interactive quality to it in terms of people really, the folks that really got into it, and kind of had, I think, almost like an entertainment value for them. So, but definitely a very kind of cult-like, and it definitely, it represents different strands of right-wing extremism in substantial ways.
Great, thank you. Our last question, I think, is going to come from Cynthia. So, and then after she asks her question and gets her answer, we're going to put up a slide for our next speaker so you can get excited for next week. All right, so let's see. All right, Cynthia, go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Simi, I have a question. Do you believe that those extremist events will continue to rise as the use of social media polarization continue to increase? And will people eventually be one-sided? And what do you believe will be the consequences for our society in that polarization?
Well, let me deal with the events first. I do think they're going to increase. I think the gravest concern right now in terms of violence is that we had an event on January 6th, mass mobilization, right? Some of the people there are going to get further radicalized, or some of the individuals who weren't there but vicariously experienced it either through live streaming or just all the tremendous amount of video footage that's widely available. They're going to get further radicalized, and I think, unfortunately, we're going to see either single actor or small cell spinoffs from the Jan 6 event. I think it's also quite possible, because that it was, I guess, fairly effective, if you want to say, use that term. At least from their perspective, they felt, pretty triumphant. That they seemed to celebrate what they were able to achieve on that day. Another mass event is certainly quite possible. There'll be detractors who think, doing that would not be necessarily wise at this point in time, and better to lay low. Anytime you have one of these mass mobilization events, it seems like you get some degree of fracturing about what to do next. And we're certainly seeing that with right-wing extremists in the current moment. But I do expect to see more violence, unfortunately. I mean, the polarization is hard to say. I mean, moments where I try to be more optimistic. I think, that younger generations, some of this is going to hopefully be less attractive, but we also see this, young people in some cases, adopting these beliefs and being involved in these networks. So they're certainly not immune from it. But in a more general sense, maybe there's some generational shifts that are going to be good news for us in terms of the polarization. But I think, for us to have real good news in the future, we're just going to have to make some tough choices about investment. Are we willing to invest in public education? Are we willing to invest in mental health? Are we willing to invest in civics? And are we willing to invest in media literacy? And if we don't make the investments that we need to build those kind of infrastructures, then I don't see a way out of this polarization.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I got one more question that I'm going to ask in the chat, and then we'll tie it off. And maybe I said a quick response, right?
Okay, very quick. I'll be quickest ever.
Yeah. In terms of social media websites like Instagram, Facebook, and whatnot, they're becoming sort of the spear of radicalization. So have they been accepted in, what is their role in the Homeland Security enterprise? I think that's essentially the question that they're asking. Have they accepted a role, and what's their interaction with DHS?
I'm going to punt to some extent on it. I mean, they have accepted the role to some extent, but I think that it's not clear to me how much responsibility they're really willing to take on this issue, and certainly misinformation more broadly. So I feel like they've got some soul searching to do. I mentioned as a society we need to make some tough decisions about building infrastructure and committing resources to do so. I think social media companies, they need to do some soul searching about the algorithms in particular and what they're willing to change on those algorithms. And if that's going to affect the business model, are they willing to make the tough decisions to change those algorithms so they don't send people down the rabbit holes the way that they have been?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Simi. We really appreciate it. A wonderful presentation. I have a notebook of questions I want to ask you, but I think we'll leave it there. And with that, I want to do a quick pitch for next week. We have Dr. Shannon Hook from, and that says Chapman. That is not correct. She is coming to us from the postgraduate naval, is it college? I always forget what it is. Institute and so she's going to be talking about QAnon and the message from the conspiracy theory that infiltrates US politics and inspires violence. So look forward for that flyer that should be coming out over the NCITE social media. And of course, please invite other colleagues, students, faculty that you feel might be interested. All right, thank you again, Dr. Simi, and a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you all.